Japanese POWs couldn't believe they were given hot showers and soap in American camps. The vast tapestry of human conflict is often woven with threads of grand narratives, the sweeping offensives, the decisive battles, the celebrated victories. Yet, beneath this familiar surface lie countless other stories, quieter, more intimate, and often more profoundly telling. These are the tales of the forgotten fronts, the overlooked experiences, the moments where the immense machinery of war intersected with individual lives in ways that history, in its relentless march, has largely sidelined. We are drawn today to one such intersection, a paradox that emerged from the brutal crucible of the Pacific Theater during World War II. It concerns a group of men, adversaries on the battlefield, who found themselves in a situation so unexpected, so contrary to their deeply ingrained perceptions, that it challenged the very foundations of their understanding of war, humanity, and themselves. Consider the setting. The Pacific, a theater of war characterized by its immense distances, its unforgiving terrain, and a brutality that often escalated to unprecedented levels. On one side, the expanding might of the United States, a nation mobilizing its industrial and human resources for a global struggle. On the other, an empire of Japan, fighting with a fierce, often fanatical dedication, fueled by a potent blend of nationalism, cultural imperatives, and a propaganda machine that painted a starkly contrasting picture of the enemy. Within this charged atmosphere, the fate of captured enemy soldiers, prisoners of war, was a complex and often grim affair. The prevailing narratives, both official and informal, often depicted captors as either indifferent or actively malevolent, and the captured as objects of scorn, dehumanized by the very act of surrender. It was against this backdrop of ingrained animosity and stark expectations that a peculiar phenomenon began to unfold within certain American prisoner-of-war camps. The story we are about to explore is not one of grand strategy or battlefield triumph. It is instead a story rooted in the quiet, almost mundane acts that can, in the face of overwhelming darkness, become astonishing revelations. It begins with a simple yet profoundly alien experience for thousands of Japanese soldiers who found themselves on the losing side of brutal campaigns. Imagine the psychological landscape of a soldier who has been taught from childhood to view surrender as the ultimate disgrace, a betrayal of honor, family, and nation. Imagine the indoctrination that painted the enemy not just as a foe, but as a subhuman entity, incapable of empathy or mercy. For these men, the prospect of capture was a fate worse than death, and then they were captured. They braced themselves for the worst, for abuse, for starvation, for a slow, agonizing end. What they encountered, however, was something that defied their deepest fears and shattered their preconceived notions of the American enemy. This script delves into that specific, disorienting reality. It is the story of Japanese prisoners of war who, instead of the brutal treatment they were led to expect, found themselves in camps where they were offered hot showers and soap. This is not a tale of universal kindness, nor is it an attempt to sanitize the horrors of war. Instead, it is an investigation into a specific set of circumstances, a moment where the stark lines between enemy and ally blurred, not through grand pronouncements of peace, but through the unexpected provision of basic human dignity. Our journey will take us beyond the immediate, astonishing fact of clean water and soap. We will explore the why behind this seemingly anomalous approach. What factors, both strategic and humanitarian, influenced the treatment of these prisoners? How did this unexpected gesture impact the psyches of men conditioned for brutality and betrayal? And what does this peculiar episode reveal about the complexities of human behavior under the extreme pressures of total war, and about the enduring power of empathy even amidst the deepest animosity? The narrative will unfold by peeling back layers of history, culture, and psychology. We will navigate the official policies and the on-the-ground realities, the propaganda that shaped perceptions and the personal accounts that reveal the lived experience. This is a story that requires us to look beyond the simplistic binaries of good versus evil, victor versus vanquished, and to confront the uncomfortable truths about how war, even at its most savage, can sometimes reveal the persistent flicker of shared humanity. We will examine the strategic calculations that may have informed such decisions, the potential efforts to influence Japanese perceptions of the war, and the nascent understanding of international humanitarian law and its practical application. But more importantly, we will focus on the profound emotional and psychological impact of these experiences on the individual soldiers, men caught in a historical maelstrom, who were suddenly confronted with an enemy that offered not just defeat, but also an unexpected, bewildering, and ultimately transformative act of care. This particular narrative is not about the well-documented atrocities that undoubtedly occurred during the war. It's about the counter-narrative, the less-told story, that complicates our understanding of that conflict. It is about the moments where the machinery of war faltered, not into complete barbarity, but into something far more complex and, in its own way, deeply unsettling for those who expected only hatred. Our exploration will be guided by historical evidence, documents, testimonies, and scholarly analysis, but it will be driven by an emotional curiosity, a desire to understand the human heart wrestling with its own preconceptions and the harsh realities of its circumstances. The path ahead is one of revelation, of confronting the unexpected, and of understanding how even in the most desolate of landscapes, the seeds of compassion, however unintended, can sometimes find fertile ground. We stand at the precipice of a story that challenges easy answers. It's a story about the vast, often contradictory nature of human beings when pushed to their limits, and about how even in the midst of a global conflagration, the simple act of providing a hot shower and a bar of soap could become an event of profound, almost unbelievable significance. This is the forgotten front we are about to enter, a space where history's grand pronouncements give way to the quiet, resonant echoes of individual human experience, and where the most potent revelations are often found not in the roar of cannons, but in the gentle flow of water and the scent of soap. The journey promises to be one of discovery, of questioning, and of a deeper understanding of the enduring paradoxes of warfare and the human spirit. The Pacific theater of World War II was a vast, brutal stage where unimaginable suffering played out across scattered islands and across immense oceans. For the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, the very concept of capture was anathema, a stain upon their honor that they were conditioned from birth to avoid at all costs. Propaganda relentlessly depicted the enemy, particularly the Americans, as inherently cruel, barbaric, and devoid of any semblance of mercy or decency. Surrender was not merely defeat, it was a profound moral failing, a betrayal of family, emperor, and nation. This deeply ingrained ideology created a psychological landscape where the prospect of becoming a prisoner of war was a fate more terrifying than death itself. The narrative of the enemy was one of dehumanization, a deliberate effort to strip them of any shared humanity, thus justifying any act of brutality against them. It was within this charged and brutal environment that the experience of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war took a turn that defied their most dire expectations. While the broader context of the war was one of immense violence and suffering, and while many Japanese POWs did indeed endure harsh conditions, a specific and often overlooked phenomenon occurred in certain American-controlled camps. This phenomenon centered on the provision of basic amenities that, for these soldiers, were not merely comforts, but astonishing revelations. The act of being offered hot showers and soap was not just a physical cleansing, it was a psychological earthquake, a direct contradiction to everything they had been taught about their captors and their own fate. This unexpected gesture challenged the very core of their worldview, forcing them to confront a reality that was far more complex and ambiguous than the stark, black-and-white narrative they had been fed. Our investigation begins precisely at this disorienting intersection. We are not here to recount the well-documented horrors of the war, nor to offer a simplistic portrayal of American benevolence. Instead, we aim to dissect a specific, paradoxical reality, the experience of Japanese POWs who found themselves receiving treatment that directly contradicted the brutal expectations cultivated by their own society and propaganda. This is the story of the unexpected, the counter-narrative to the pervasive narrative of unremitting animosity. It is about how, in the midst of a conflict characterized by extreme violence, the provision of fundamental human dignities, hot water, soap, became an event of such profound significance that it could alter a soldier's perception of their enemy and, by extension, the very nature of war itself. The journey we are embarking upon is an exploration into the why and the how of this anomaly. What were the underlying factors, both strategic and humanitarian, that led to the implementation of such measures in specific POW camps? How did these acts, seemingly small in the grand scheme of global conflict, resonate within the minds of men who believed they were destined for nothing but degradation and suffering? This script will delve into the historical context, examining the prevailing international laws, the evolving American policies towards POWs, and the psychological warfare considerations at play. But crucially, it will focus on the human element, the emotional and philosophical implications of these encounters. We will seek to understand the internal conflicts these soldiers must have experienced, the cognitive dissonance created by an enemy who, while victorious on the battlefield, extended a hand of basic human care. This is not a story about heroes or villains in the conventional sense. It is a story about the complexities of human behavior under duress, the surprising capacity for empathy that can emerge even in the darkest of times, and the profound impact of seemingly small gestures on deeply held beliefs. We will navigate through official documents, personal testimonies, and historical analyses to reconstruct this forgotten facet of World War II. The aim is to illuminate a corner of history that challenges simplistic narratives and encourages a more nuanced understanding of conflict, morality, and the enduring, often contradictory nature of humanity. The stage is set for an exploration that promises to be both intellectually stimulating and emotionally resonant, a journey into a moment where the lines between enemy and human were, however briefly and paradoxically, redrawn. The rigid adherence to honor within Japanese military culture, often enforced through severe social and familial pressure, created a profound psychological chasm for those who found themselves unable to fulfill the ultimate expectation of dying for the emperor. The concept of Bushido, the warrior's code, while romanticized, dictated a life of unwavering loyalty and a death that brought glory. To surrender was to become mushin, a non-person, stripped of all societal standing and familial connection. This internalized dread meant that the very idea of being treated with a degree of humanity by the enemy was not just surprising, it was existentially disorienting. It forced a re-evaluation of the enemy's supposed subhuman nature, introducing a cognitive dissonance that war psychologists later termed cognitive dissonance. Imagine a soldier who has endured the horrors of Guadalcanal or Tarawa, who has witnessed the ferocity of American assaults and absorbed the propaganda demonizing the enemy. Then, to find himself in a situation where he is offered a clean towel and directed towards a shower facility, the steam rising around him, the scent of soap a stark contrast to the battlefield stench of cordite and decay. It was a sensory and psychological paradox of immense proportions. Furthermore, the American approach wasn't a monolithic act of pure altruism. It was a complex strategy layered with various motivations. Beyond the nascent understanding of international humanitarian conventions, such as the Geneva Conventions, which the US had ratified but Japan had not fully embraced in practice, there were pragmatic considerations. The sheer scale of the Pacific War meant that capturing vast numbers of enemy soldiers was an unavoidable reality. Maintaining order and preventing disease within POW camps was crucial for the operational efficiency of the American forces. Unsanitary conditions and widespread illness among prisoners could quickly become a drain on resources and a potential vector for epidemics that could affect the captors as well. Therefore, providing basic hygiene facilities like hot showers and soap served a dual purpose. It addressed a fundamental human need, thereby potentially mitigating some of the inherent brutality of captivity, and it also acted as a public health measure, safeguarding the camp population as a whole. Building on this strategic imperative, another crucial layer was the emerging understanding of psychological warfare. While direct engagement with enemy propaganda was often confrontational, subtle gestures could also have a significant impact. The deliberate provision of amenities that were antithetical to the enemy's expectations could sow seeds of doubt about their own leadership's narrative. If the enemy, painted as monstrous, was capable of such basic acts of care, what did that imply about the righteousness of their own cause or the truthfulness of their leaders? This wasn't about winning hearts and minds in a conventional sense, but about introducing a crack in the monolithic facade of enemy identity, potentially impacting morale and future willingness to fight. Consider the ripple effect. A soldier who returns home, not with tales of unmitigated American barbarity, but with the bewildering memory of a hot shower and the feel of soap, carries a narrative that complicates the very definition of enemy. Conversely, it's vital to acknowledge that this was not a universal experience across all camps, nor was it always consistently applied. The realities of war meant that resources were often stretched thin, and the attitudes of individual camp commanders and guards played a significant role. Some camps were indeed notoriously brutal, reflecting the prevailing animosities and the immense stress of the conflict. However, the very existence of camps where such unexpected civility was extended highlights a fascinating tension within the American war effort. A tension between the dehumanizing logic of total war and the persistent, often inconvenient presence of human empathy. This duality is what makes the story of the hot showers and soap so compelling. It wasn't simply about a policy, it was about the human choices made within the rigid structures of war. Choices that could, for a fleeting moment, redefine the boundaries of conflict and offer a glimpse of something beyond the all-consuming rage of battle. The impact of these simple acts on the individual soldier cannot be overstated. For men who had been conditioned to believe their enemy was a demon, the experience of being treated with a modicum of respect, of having their basic physical needs met, was profoundly unsettling. It was a quiet subversion of the very principles for which they had been fighting and were expected to die. This wasn't about forgiveness or a sudden embrace of the enemy. It was about a fundamental, almost shocking recognition of shared humanity. The scent of soap, the warmth of the water, these were not just physical sensations. They were tactile evidence that contradicted a lifetime of indoctrination, forcing a re-evaluation of what it meant to be human and what it meant to be an enemy. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where your entire worldview is challenged by an unexpected act of kindness from someone you have been taught to despise. It creates a profound internal conflict, a wrestling with deeply ingrained beliefs against undeniable personal experience. The pervasive influence of propaganda on both sides of the conflict undeniably shaped perceptions, but the American approach to POWs, particularly the provision of basic hygiene, also intersected with a more nuanced understanding of long-term strategic objectives. Beyond the immediate tactical benefits of maintaining healthy camps, there was a growing awareness, particularly within certain branches of the US military and intelligence, of the war's protracted nature and the potential for future geopolitical landscapes. The idea wasn't simply to win the current battle, but to influence the post-war order. By demonstrating a level of adherence to humanitarian principles, even towards a reviled enemy, the United States was subtly crafting an image that could resonate long after the last shot was fired. This was a calculated projection of values, an attempt to establish a moral high ground that could be leveraged in the complex diplomatic and ideological struggles that would inevitably follow the cessation of hostilities. Consider, for instance, the strategic implications of influencing Japanese society at a foundational level. While direct communication was heavily restricted, the experiences of returning soldiers, even those who had been prisoners, could carry significant weight. A soldier returning with tales of being treated with a degree of dignity, however minimal, offered a counter-narrative to the official line of Japanese exceptionalism and the absolute barbarity of the enemy. This was not about fostering immediate defection or mass surrender based on comfort. It was about planting seeds of doubt, introducing inconsistencies into the enemy's self-perception and their perception of the war's true character. This subtle erosion of ideological certainty could, in the long run, contribute to a less adversarial post-war relationship, or at least one where the basis for future cooperation, however tentative, might exist. The map of future alliances and ideological battles was, in a way, being drawn even as the current conflict raged. Another crucial layer to this seemingly simple act lies in the evolving understanding of the psychological impact of prolonged captivity and the potential for rehabilitation. While the primary goal was undoubtedly to secure and manage prisoners, there was an emerging, albeit often secondary, consideration for the mental well-being of these individuals. The intense stress and trauma of warfare, coupled with the psychological shock of surrender and confinement, could lead to severe mental health issues. The provision of hot showers and soap, while not a panacea, represented a basic acknowledgement of the prisoners' humanity, a recognition that they were not merely objects to be contained, but individuals capable of experiencing physical comfort and discomfort. This approach, though perhaps driven by a blend of humanitarianism and practical necessity, foreshadowed later developments in the understanding of trauma-informed care and the psychological dimensions of conflict resolution. Now think about how this applies when you are confronted with a situation where the traditional methods of dealing with an adversary are proving insufficient or counterproductive. The American military, in some instances, was experimenting with a more sophisticated form of engagement. It was a recognition that simply outgunning or outmaneuvering the enemy on the battlefield might not be enough to secure a lasting peace or to dismantle the deeply ingrained ideological structures that fueled their resistance. By offering these basic amenities, they were, in effect, creating a controlled environment where the enemy's deeply held beliefs about their captors could be subtly challenged. It was a silent experiment in social engineering, a quiet attempt to introduce an element of unexpected humanity into the brutal calculus of war, with implications that extended far beyond the immediate confines of the prisoner of war camps. The scent of soap, in this context, carried the faint aroma of a future, more complex geopolitical reality. The profound psychological impact of the hot showers and soap on Japanese POWs stemmed not merely from the physical sensation, but from the stark contrast it presented to their deeply ingrained cultural narratives of honor and an enemy's inherent depravity. The act of surrender itself was considered the ultimate disgrace, a betrayal of the warrior's code, Bushido, which emphasized dying in battle over capitulation. Soldiers were indoctrinated to believe that capture meant not only personal shame, but also bringing dishonor upon their families and their emperor. The enemy, particularly the Americans, were systematically portrayed as savage, subhuman beings incapable of empathy or mercy, their defeat a testament to their moral and spiritual weakness. Thus, encountering an enemy who, despite holding them captive, provided basic amenities like cleanliness was not simply unexpected. It was existentially disorienting. It introduced a profound cognitive dissonance, forcing these soldiers to grapple with information that directly contradicted a lifetime of conditioning and propaganda. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where your entire worldview is challenged by an unexpected act of kindness from someone you have been taught to despise. This internal conflict manifested in various ways. For some, it fostered suspicion, a belief that these gestures were merely a cunning tactic, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to lull them into a false sense of security before a more brutal fate befell them. They might have interpreted the cleanliness as a prelude to further manipulation, a way to weaken their resolve or to extract information through subtle means. This deep-seated distrust, a product of intense wartime indoctrination, made it difficult for many to accept the sincerity of these amenities at face value. The very simplicity of the act became a source of suspicion. If the enemy were truly as monstrous as they were led to believe, why would they offer such basic comforts? However, for others, this unexpected humanity began to chip away at the monolithic image of the enemy. The tangible reality of warm water and soap provided a stark counterpoint to the abstract narratives of barbarity. It was a direct, sensory experience that suggested a complexity in the opposing force that their own leadership had deliberately obscured. This could lead to a slow, often unacknowledged, re-evaluation of the enemy's nature. It didn't necessarily translate into immediate loyalty or a change in allegiance, but it could foster a sense of bewilderment, a questioning of the absolute truths they had held. Imagine a soldier who, after enduring the brutal realities of island-hopping campaigns, finds himself in a situation where the enemy, the very force that inflicted such suffering, offers him a chance to wash away the grime and stench of battle. This act, however small, introduces a variable that the enemy's propaganda had entirely omitted: the possibility of empathy from the other side. Furthermore, the psychological effect extended to the very concept of surrender. For a soldier conditioned to view surrender as the ultimate degradation, the experience of being treated with a degree of basic human dignity, however minimal, could subtly alter the perception of this act. While it did not erase the shame associated with defeat, it introduced a mitigating factor. It suggested that perhaps surrender did not automatically equate to complete dehumanization and utter barbarity. This could have had a long-term impact on the psychological state of returning soldiers, creating a more complex internal narrative about their wartime experiences, one that included not only the horrors of combat and capture, but also these bewildering moments of unexpected, albeit calculated, civility. The lingering scent of soap in this light became a symbol of a more ambiguous, less black-and-white reality than the one they had been forced to inhabit. The strategic underpinnings of providing basic amenities to Japanese POWs extended beyond immediate camp management and psychological manipulation. A critical, often overlooked element was the United States' broader geopolitical strategy in the Pacific. As the war progressed, American planners began to consider the post-war landscape and the complex relationship that would need to be forged with a defeated, yet still influential Japan. The treatment of prisoners was not merely a matter of wartime ethics, it was an early, albeit subtle, diplomatic tool. By demonstrating a degree of adherence to international norms of humane treatment, even under the immense pressures of total war, The US aimed to shape perceptions not only within Japan, but also on the global stage. This was about projecting an image of a nation that, while capable of immense military power, also valued principles that could form the basis of future international cooperation. Furthermore, the US military was increasingly grappling with the logistical and ethical complexities of occupying enemy territory and managing large populations in the aftermath of conflict. The experience gained in managing POW camps provided invaluable, if often harsh, lessons. Understanding how to effectively and humanely manage a large, potentially hostile, captive population was a skill that would be crucial for long-term stability in occupied territories. The provision of basic services, like hygiene facilities, therefore, served as a practical training ground. It allowed American forces to develop protocols and infrastructure that could be adapted and scaled for broader post-war administration. Think of it as a pilot program for managing a complex, diverse population under challenging circumstances, where the success of the mission depended as much on logistical efficiency as it did on maintaining a degree of order and preventing widespread unrest. Another significant layer to this strategy involved the deliberate, albeit often unstated, effort to sow internal dissent within Japan's rigid social and military structure. The intense pressure to conform and the severe penalties for perceived failure meant that any deviation from the expected narrative could have a profound impact. When soldiers returned from captivity, their personal accounts, however fragmented or filtered through their own biases, carried weight. A narrative that included unexpected acts of basic human decency from the enemy directly challenged the official Japanese portrayal of an implacable and monstrous foe. This introduction of ambiguity, this crack in the ideological armor, could subtly undermine the absolute authority of the military leadership and the pervasive propaganda machine. It was a form of indirect influence, a quiet disruption of the enemy's internal cohesion. Consider how this applies when you are tasked with dismantling an enemy's will to fight not through overwhelming force alone, but by introducing doubt and complexity into their ideological framework. The US military was, in some instances, engaging in a form of subtle psychological warfare that complemented its overt military actions. The provision of hot showers and soap was not merely about comfort. It was about introducing a tangible reality that contradicted the abstract enemy image. It was a quiet assertion that the enemy was not a faceless, monolithic entity devoid of any redeeming qualities. This strategy, while not always explicitly articulated or consistently applied across all camps, represented a more sophisticated understanding of total war, one that recognized the importance of influencing not just the battlefield, but also the minds and perceptions of the enemy population. The lingering scent of soap in this context was the faint yet persistent aroma of a future where ideological warfare would become as critical as any military engagement. The very act of providing clean water and soap, while seemingly straightforward, represented a radical departure from the brutal realities that defined much of the Pacific War. It introduced a tangible, sensory experience that directly contradicted the deeply ingrained narratives of enemy depravity. For the Japanese soldier, conditioned by years of propaganda to view the Americans as inherently cruel and subhuman, this encounter was profoundly disorienting. It created a psychological paradox. How could an enemy painted as utterly monstrous exhibit such basic, almost mundane acts of care? This dissonance wasn't merely an intellectual puzzle. It was an emotional and existential challenge, forcing a re-evaluation of fundamental beliefs about self, enemy, and the very nature of the conflict. Now consider how this applies when you must reconcile a deeply held belief with undeniable, lived experience. For many Japanese POWs, this internal conflict manifested as profound suspicion. They had been taught that such gestures were merely a cunning tactic, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to deceive them before a more brutal fate was inflicted. The very simplicity and unexpectedness of the amenity became a source of distrust. If the enemy were truly as savage as their leaders proclaimed, why would they offer such basic comforts? This ingrained skepticism, a product of intense wartime indoctrination and the fear of reprisal for any perceived misstep, made it difficult to accept the sincerity of these gestures at face value. The warmth of the water, the feel of the soap, these were not necessarily perceived as acts of kindness, but as potential instruments of manipulation, designed to weaken their resolve or extract information through subtle means. However, for a significant subset of these prisoners, the persistent reality of these basic amenities began to erode the monolithic image of the enemy. The tangible evidence of cleanliness, of a moment of respite from the grime and stench of war, provided a stark counterpoint to the abstract narratives of barbarity. This wasn't about immediate forgiveness or a sudden embrace of the enemy's cause, but about a subtle, often unacknowledged re-evaluation of their adversary's nature. It introduced a complexity that their own leadership had deliberately omitted from the wartime narrative. Imagine a soldier who has witnessed and endured the relentless brutality of jungle warfare, only to find himself in a situation where the very force responsible for his capture offers him a chance to cleanse himself, to reclaim a sliver of his former self. This act, however small, introduced a variable that the enemy's propaganda had entirely overlooked: the possibility of shared humanity, even amidst profound animosity. Furthermore, the psychological effect of these basic provisions extended to the very concept of surrender. For soldiers conditioned to view capitulation as the ultimate disgrace, the antithesis of honor, the experience of being treated with a degree of fundamental human dignity, served as a mitigating factor. While it did not erase the profound shame associated with defeat, it subtly altered the perception of what capture entailed. It suggested that perhaps surrender did not automatically necessitate complete dehumanization or a descent into abject barbarity. This created a more nuanced internal narrative for the returning soldier, one that could encompass not only the horrors of combat and confinement, but also these bewildering moments of unexpected, albeit strategically motivated, civility. The lingering scent of soap, therefore, became a potent symbol, representing a reality far more ambiguous and complex than the stark black-and-white world of wartime propaganda. The integration of hygiene practices within American POW camps wasn't solely a matter of humanitarianism or strategic foresight. It also represented a significant, albeit often implicit, engagement with the evolving norms of international law and the nascent field of wartime psychology. While Japan had not ratified the full scope of the Geneva Conventions, the United States, having ratified them, was under considerable pressure, both domestically and internationally, to adhere to their provisions regarding the humane treatment of prisoners. The provision of regular bathing facilities and soap, while seemingly basic, was a direct manifestation of these evolving standards. This wasn't merely about following rules, it was about establishing a precedent, a demonstration that even in the crucible of total war, certain fundamental human dignities were to be upheld. This commitment, even when applied selectively or strategically, contributed to the broader international discourse on the conduct of warfare and the protection of those caught within its machinery. Now consider how this applies when you are tasked with balancing the brutal realities of conflict with the evolving ethical frameworks governing it. The American military's approach, therefore, can be viewed as a practical, albeit imperfect, implementation of these emerging international standards. It wasn't always about pure altruism. It was also about demonstrating compliance, about projecting an image of a nation committed to a higher moral ground, even when dealing with an enemy that was often perceived as having abandoned such principles. This duality is crucial. The strategic imperative to win the war and the ethical imperative to adhere to certain standards were not mutually exclusive, but were often intertwined. The act of providing soap in this context became a small but significant symbol of this complex interplay between pragmatism and principle. Furthermore, the psychological dimension of these amenities extended to the very concept of morale, not just for the prisoners, but also for the captors. Maintaining discipline and order within a POW camp was a constant challenge. Overcrowding, disease, and the inherent stress of confinement could easily lead to unrest. By providing a basic level of comfort and hygiene, American camp administrators could potentially mitigate some of the factors that contributed to prisoner dissatisfaction and potential rebellion. A cleaner, healthier prisoner population was, in a practical sense, a more manageable one. This wasn't about coddling the enemy, but about employing a more sophisticated approach to control, one that recognized the psychological impact of basic physical well-being on behavior. Think of it as a calculated investment in stability. A small expenditure on hygiene could potentially avert larger, more costly security incidents. Building on this, another crucial layer to consider is the long-term impact on the perception of American power and influence. By demonstrating a capacity for organized, relatively humane management of captured enemy combatants, the United States was subtly shaping the narrative of its global role. This was not about immediate battlefield gains, but about the construction of a post-war order. The image of a nation that could defeat its enemies decisively, yet also adhere to certain humanitarian principles, was a powerful one, particularly in contrast to the brutal conduct often associated with other belligerents. The act of providing a hot shower and soap, therefore, was a small but significant component in the broader project of projecting American values and establishing its legitimacy as a leading global power. It was a quiet assertion that victory on the battlefield could be coupled with a commitment to a more civilized form of engagement, a message that resonated far beyond the confines of the POW camps. Consequently, the lingering scent of soap became a subtle testament to a more complex and perhaps more enduring form of power projection. The psychological ramifications of the unexpected amenities extended to Japanese prisoners of war extended beyond mere suspicion or a dawning awareness of the enemy's complexity. For many, these acts served as a stark, almost painful reminder of the stringent social hierarchies and the absolute expectations of self-sacrifice that permeated their own society. The intense pressure to conform, enforced through rigid social codes and the ever-present threat of disgrace, meant that any deviation from the prescribed path of a warrior was met with severe condemnation. To be captured and then to receive even a modicum of care directly challenged this rigid framework. It introduced a dissonance between the idealized image of the warrior, one who dies rather than surrenders, and the lived reality of survival, however begrudgingly provided. Now, consider how this applies when you are forced to reconcile a deeply ingrained cultural imperative with the undeniable reality of your own survival. The shame associated with surrender was not merely personal, it carried implications for one's family and community, a burden of dishonor that extended across generations. The provision of a hot shower and soap, therefore, did not simply alleviate physical discomfort. It inadvertently highlighted the stark contrast between the idealized code of Bushido and the pragmatic necessities of survival in captivity. This could foster a complex internal dialogue, where the soldier might privately question the absolute righteousness of a cause that led to such suffering, or the efficacy of a code that offered no solace in the face of overwhelming defeat. It was a quiet, internal rebellion against the very ideology that had driven them to war. Furthermore, the American approach, while often driven by strategic considerations, also inadvertently tapped into a deeper, more universal human need for dignity. In the brutal calculus of war, where individuals were often reduced to statistics or strategic assets, the simple act of being treated as a human being, capable of feeling discomfort and appreciating cleanliness, could have a profound impact. This recognition, however minimal, served as a powerful counterpoint to the dehumanizing forces of conflict. It was a quiet assertion of shared humanity, a reminder that even across the trenches of animosity, the fundamental needs and vulnerabilities of individuals remained. This didn't necessarily foster friendship or erase animosity, but it introduced a layer of complexity that defied the simplistic enemy, other dichotomy. Building on this, another crucial layer is the way these experiences might have subtly influenced the long-term perception of the war and its aftermath. Soldiers who returned with memories not solely of unremitting barbarity, but also of these unexpected moments of basic civility, carried a more nuanced narrative. This complexity could, over time, contribute to a less absolute and more reflective understanding of the conflict. It introduced the possibility that the enemy, while defeated, was not entirely devoid of human qualities, and that their motivations and actions were not as monolithic as portrayed. This nuanced perspective, though often unspoken or suppressed, could play a role in the eventual reconciliation and rebuilding processes that followed the war, offering a foundation, however fragile, for future understanding. Consequently, the lingering scent of soap in this context began to symbolize not just survival, but the complex, often contradictory nature of human interaction, even in the most extreme circumstances. The strategic application of hygiene in POW camps served a dual purpose that extended beyond mere operational efficiency or basic humanitarianism. It was, in essence, an early foray into the complex field of information warfare, where the battlefield extended beyond physical territory into the realm of perception and belief. The Japanese military machine was fueled by an exceptionally potent propaganda apparatus that meticulously cultivated an image of unwavering national superiority and an unassailable warrior ethos. Central to this narrative was the absolute abhorrence of surrender, which was portrayed not just as a military defeat, but as a profound moral and spiritual failing, a betrayal of everything the individual and the nation stood for. Consequently, the enemy was systematically depicted as inherently barbaric, devoid of any empathy or human decency, thus justifying any act of extreme violence against them and reinforcing the imperative to fight to the death. Now, consider how this applies when you are confronted with an adversary whose very identity is predicated on a perception of your absolute depravity. The American provision of hot showers and soap directly challenged this deeply ingrained narrative. It introduced a tangible, sensory experience that was utterly incongruous with the enemy's portrayal of the captors. This wasn't about fostering immediate affection or trust. It was about introducing a seed of doubt, a crack in the monolithic facade of enemy identity. The very act of being treated with a basic level of physical care, of having one's fundamental need for cleanliness met, subtly contradicted the absolute narrative of barbarity. It was akin to finding an unexpected oasis in a desert that was supposed to be devoid of life. This introduced a cognitive dissonance, forcing soldiers to reconcile their deeply held beliefs with the undeniable reality of their immediate experience. Furthermore, this approach served as a sophisticated, if indirect, method of psychological engagement. By providing amenities that were antithetical to the expected treatment, American authorities were, in effect, subtly undermining the enemy's morale and their faith in their own leadership's narrative. If the enemy, painted as monstrous, was capable of such basic acts of care, what did that imply about the unwavering righteousness of their own cause? This wasn't about winning hearts and minds in a conventional sense, but about introducing a level of ambiguity and complexity that the enemy's rigid ideological framework struggled to accommodate. It was a quiet subversion, a challenge to the very foundations of their belief system, delivered not through direct confrontation, but through the unexpected provision of a clean towel and the scent of soap. Another crucial layer to this strategy was its potential long-term impact on the post-war geopolitical landscape. Even as the war raged, American planners were beginning to consider the shape of the future. The way in which captured enemy soldiers were treated could significantly influence post-war perceptions and the potential for reconciliation. By demonstrating a capacity for humane treatment, even towards a reviled enemy, the United States was subtly crafting an image that could resonate long after the conflict ended. This was not altruism in its purest form, but a calculated projection of values and a demonstration of a more sophisticated approach to international relations. The aim was to establish a moral high ground, to differentiate American conduct from that of other belligerents, and to lay the groundwork for a future where a defeated Japan might be integrated into a new global order rather than remain a perpetual adversary. Consequently, the lingering scent of soap in these camps became a subtle yet potent testament to a more nuanced and far-reaching strategy than the battlefield alone could reveal. The strategic implications of providing basic hygiene to Japanese POWs also extended into the realm of long-term societal influence, a subtle but potent aspect of post-war planning. While the immediate goal was to manage the prisoner population and potentially sow discord within enemy ranks, the US also recognized that the defeated nation of Japan would eventually need to be rebuilt and reintegrated into the international community. The treatment of its soldiers, even those captured, was not an isolated wartime incident, but a foundational element in shaping future perceptions of American power and its underlying values. By demonstrating a commitment to certain humanitarian standards, however inconsistently applied, the US was laying the groundwork for a post-war relationship that was less about pure subjugation and more about establishing a framework for future cooperation, however strained. This was a long-term investment in a stable Pacific, where a defeated Japan could become a partner rather than a perpetual antagonist. Now, consider how this applies when you are tasked with not just winning a war, but also shaping the very nature of the peace that follows. The American approach to POWs, therefore, can be seen as an early, perhaps even unintentional exercise in nation-building and diplomatic influence. The experiences of returning Japanese soldiers, carrying with them memories of unexpected civility amidst the brutality, could contribute to a more nuanced understanding of their former enemy. This nuance was crucial in the complex process of demilitarization and democratization that followed the war. It offered a counterpoint to the narrative of absolute Japanese victimhood, or the unyielding narrative of American aggression, paving the way for a more balanced historical reckoning within Japan itself. The scent of soap in this context was the faint aroma of a future where shared understanding, however grudging, could begin to emerge. Furthermore, the practical challenges of managing vast numbers of prisoners across the sprawling Pacific theater necessitated the development of standardized procedures. While the ideal of humane treatment was present, the sheer logistical strain meant that efficiency was paramount. Establishing protocols for sanitation, food distribution and medical care, even at a basic level, was essential for maintaining order and preventing widespread disease outbreaks that could cripple American military operations. The provision of hot showers and soap, therefore, was not just an ethical consideration, but a practical necessity for camp administration. Think of it as a complex logistical puzzle where the well-being of the prisoners was intrinsically linked to the operational effectiveness of the captors. A sick or rebellious prisoner population was a liability. A relatively healthy and contained one was a manageable asset. Building on this pragmatic foundation, there was also an evolving understanding within some military circles of the psychological impact of prolonged captivity and the potential for trauma. While the primary focus remained on security and control, there was a growing, albeit often secondary, recognition that the mental state of prisoners could influence their behavior and, consequently, the stability of the camps. The provision of basic amenities, such as regular opportunities for hygiene, served as a rudimentary form of psychological decompression. It offered a moment of respite from the harsh realities of confinement, a small but significant acknowledgement of the prisoner's humanity that could potentially mitigate extreme despair or aggression. This wasn't about fostering camaraderie, but about managing a volatile human element through the application of basic physiological and psychological needs. Consequently, the simple act of washing became a small but critical component in the broader strategy of maintaining control and order within the complex and often volatile environment of a POW camp. The operational reality within many American POW camps presented a stark contrast to the idealized images often projected by wartime propaganda, both American and Japanese. While the strategic imperative to maintain a degree of order and project a certain image certainly influenced policy, the day-to-day implementation was often a complex dance between resource limitations, the personalities of individual commanders, and the sheer unpredictability of wartime conditions. The provision of hot showers and soap, therefore, was not a uniformly applied, perfectly executed directive. Instead, it was a practice that existed on a spectrum, with some camps excelling in its consistent delivery, while others struggled significantly due to shortages, damaged facilities, or a less sympathetic command structure. This variability itself became a crucial factor in shaping the prisoners' perceptions, introducing an element of uncertainty that further complicated their understanding of their captors. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where the stated policy clashes with the practical, on-the-ground implementation. For a Japanese soldier, experiencing a camp where clean water was readily available and soap was a regular amenity would be profoundly different from being in a facility where such provisions were sporadic, rationed, or entirely absent. These discrepancies could amplify the psychological impact. In a well-run camp, the unexpected civility might foster a deeper sense of bewilderment and a more significant questioning of ingrained beliefs. Conversely, in a camp where such amenities were scarce or non-existent, the memory of them, perhaps heard from fellow prisoners from other locations, could intensify the sense of betrayal or reinforce the belief that the enemy was indeed capricious and untrustworthy. The map of their experience was not uniform. It was a patchwork of vastly different realities, each contributing to a unique internal landscape. Furthermore, the very nature of the Pacific War, characterized by its vast distances and decentralized command structures, meant that information and resources flowed unevenly. A directive issued from a central command in Hawaii or Guam might take weeks or even months to be fully implemented or even understood at a remote island outpost. This delay and potential for misinterpretation meant that the policy of providing hygiene could, in practice, become a privilege dictated by geography and the efficiency of local logistics. The smell of soap might be a common scent in one camp, while in another, the memory of it would be a distant, almost mythical concept. This unevenness highlights the often unseen complexities of executing grand strategies in the chaotic environment of total war, where abstract directives often collided with the harsh realities of limited resources and vast, unforgiving distances. Another crucial layer to this operational reality is the role of the individual guards and lower-ranking officers. While higher command might have established policies, the direct interaction between captor and captive was mediated by the attitudes and personal biases of those on the front lines of camp administration. Some individuals, perhaps motivated by a sense of duty, a nascent understanding of humanitarian principles, or simply a desire to maintain order with minimal fuss, would go to greater lengths to ensure these amenities were provided. Others, perhaps driven by lingering animosity, a lack of resources, or a simple disregard for the prisoner's well-being, might actively neglect or even obstruct these provisions. This human element, the unpredictable factor of individual behavior within a rigid system, added another layer of complexity to the prisoner's experience, making each camp a unique microcosm of wartime realities. Consequently, the scent of soap in a POW camp was not just a marker of hygiene. It was a subtle indicator of the underlying human dynamics at play, a sensory clue to the varying degrees of humanity that could persist even in the heart of conflict. The psychological impact of the contrasting treatment within different POW camps created a complex web of perceptions among the Japanese soldiers. While some camps offered a semblance of order and basic hygiene, others were characterized by severe overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and a pervasive sense of neglect. This disparity wasn't merely a matter of comfort. It directly influenced how prisoners interpreted the broader war effort and the nature of their captors. Soldiers who experienced consistently harsh conditions might have found their belief in the enemy's barbarity reinforced, seeing any perceived leniency elsewhere as a mere tactical anomaly or a sign of the enemy's inherent inconsistency. Conversely, those who encountered camps where basic amenities were provided might have begun to question the narrative of absolute malevolence, even if they remained deeply suspicious of the underlying motives. This fractured reality meant that the American enemy was not a monolithic entity, but a spectrum of experiences, each contributing to a unique and often contradictory understanding of their situation. Now, consider how this applies when you are forced to navigate a landscape where the very nature of your adversary seems to shift depending on your location. This variability meant that the effectiveness of any perceived psychological warfare strategy was inherently limited. The consistent message of enemy depravity, so carefully cultivated by Japanese propaganda, could be subtly undermined by first-hand accounts of unexpected, albeit limited, acts of care. However, these accounts were not uniform. A soldier returning from one camp might speak of a modicum of order and cleanliness, while another, having endured a different facility, might recount tales of abject misery and neglect. This lack of a singular, consistent experience prevented a unified shift in perception. Instead, it fostered a fragmented understanding, where individual experiences, rather than a cohesive enemy portrayal, began to shape individual soldiers' views. This created a challenging environment for the propagandists, who struggled to maintain a singular, unwavering narrative in the face of such diverse lived realities. Furthermore, the very concept of honor within the Japanese military context was deeply intertwined with the idea of perseverance and the avoidance of shame. Surrender, as previously noted, was the ultimate disgrace. The provision of amenities, therefore, did not erase this fundamental cultural imperative. Instead, it introduced a peculiar tension. While the physical conditions might have been less dire than anticipated, the psychological weight of being a prisoner, of having failed to meet the ultimate expectation of dying for the emperor, remained. The clean water and soap offered a temporary physical reprieve, but they could not, in themselves, alleviate the profound sense of personal and familial dishonor. This meant that even in camps where treatment was relatively decent, the underlying psychological burden of captivity persisted, often manifesting as quiet resignation or a deep-seated melancholy, rather than overt defiance or gratitude. Building on this, another crucial layer is how these disparate experiences influence the long-term memory and historical narratives. Soldiers who returned with memories of relative comfort might have found their accounts met with skepticism or even outright disbelief by those who had endured the harshest conditions or who adhered rigidly to the official narrative of enemy barbarity. This created a subtle schism within the repatriated population, where differing wartime experiences led to varied interpretations of the conflict and its aftermath. The memory of a hot shower, while significant on a personal level, could become a point of contention or a source of quiet internal conflict when juxtaposed with the pervasive narrative of unmitigated suffering. Consequently, the scent of soap, for some, became a symbol of a bewildering paradox, a testament to a reality that defied easy categorization and challenged the very definition of an enemy. The long-term implications of the varied treatment of Japanese POWs extended into the very fabric of post-war Japanese society and its evolving national identity. As soldiers returned, their fragmented experiences of captivity, ranging from stark deprivation to surprising moments of basic human care, began to filter into public consciousness. This created a subtle but significant challenge to the monolithic narrative of wartime victimhood that would later become a dominant theme in Japan's post-war historical discourse. The existence of individuals who had experienced something other than unadulterated enemy barbarity complicated the simple dichotomy of victim and perpetrator. It introduced a layer of nuance, suggesting that the enemy, while victorious, was not entirely devoid of complex motivations or capabilities, including the capacity for actions that defied the expected script of pure malice. Now, consider how this applies when you are faced with reconciling diverse personal experiences with a collectively constructed national narrative. For many returning soldiers, the memories of hot showers and soap, however strategically motivated by the Americans, represented a tangible counterpoint to the prevailing narrative of absolute suffering and justified national grievance. This didn't necessarily negate their wartime hardships or their sense of loss, but it introduced a complexity that made the straightforward victim narrative less absolute. It was a quiet internal recalibration, a personal grappling with a reality that refused to fit neatly into predefined categories of good and evil. This internal dissonance, while often unspoken, contributed to a more multifaceted understanding of the war's human cost, one that acknowledged both immense suffering and unexpected moments of human interaction. Furthermore, the American military's approach to POW hygiene, even when inconsistently applied, contributed to a broader international dialogue about the conduct of warfare and the ethical responsibilities of victors. As the war concluded and the world grappled with the immense scale of destruction and the atrocities committed by all sides, the treatment of prisoners of war became a critical focal point in discussions about accountability and the future of international law. The very existence of American camps where basic sanitation was provided, even if for strategic reasons, offered a point of comparison and a benchmark against which the actions of other belligerents could be measured. This contributed to the eventual strengthening of international humanitarian law and the establishment of norms that sought to prevent the complete dehumanization of enemy combatants in future conflicts. Building on this, another crucial layer is the subtle influence these experiences had on the perception of American power itself. Beyond military might, the US sought to project an image of a nation that, while capable of waging war decisively, also adhered to certain principles of order and civility. The management of POW camps, including the provision of basic amenities, became a tangible manifestation of this projection. It demonstrated a capacity for organization, resource management, and to some extent, a degree of restraint. This contributed to the broader narrative of American exceptionalism, not just as a military superpower, but as a nation with a foundational commitment to certain values that could, in theory, extend even to its adversaries. Consequently, the lingering scent of soap in these camps became a subtle symbol of a more complex and multifaceted form of global influence, one that extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of international norms and perceptions. The strategic dissemination of information regarding the treatment of Japanese POWs also played a crucial role in shaping international perceptions, particularly within neutral nations and among allied populations less directly involved in the Pacific theater. Official communiques and carefully curated news reports, while often downplaying the more complex realities, would highlight instances of adherence to humanitarian standards. This served to reinforce the image of the United States as a just and principled combatant, a stark contrast to the more brutal narratives that often characterized the war in Europe. Consequently, even amidst the widespread condemnation of Japanese wartime atrocities, the narrative of American conduct in POW camps, even if selective, contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the Allied war effort. This wasn't about justifying the war, but about subtly influencing the global discourse on international conduct during conflict, positioning the US as a force for order and a proponent of a future governed by established norms. Now consider how this applies when you must present a complex, multifaceted reality to a global audience often predisposed to simplistic narratives of good versus evil. The carefully managed dissemination of information regarding the POW camps was, in essence, a form of soft power projection. It demonstrated that American military strength was coupled with a commitment to principles that transcended immediate battlefield objectives. This was particularly important in influencing public opinion in countries that were either neutral or wavering in their support for the Allied cause. By showcasing instances of humane treatment, even towards a reviled enemy, the US aimed to solidify its image as a responsible global power, capable of upholding ethical standards even under the immense pressures of total war. This strategic communication aimed to build a reservoir of goodwill that could be leveraged in the post-war era, fostering alliances and shaping the international order. Furthermore, the internal dynamics within the Japanese military and government also reacted, albeit often with suspicion, to these external signals. While official propaganda continued to demonize the enemy, the trickle of information from returning soldiers, coupled with observations from international observers or neutral parties, could create inconsistencies within the enemy's own information ecosystem. A government committed to portraying its soldiers as martyrs, facing an utterly merciless foe, found it increasingly difficult to reconcile this narrative with reports of captured soldiers receiving basic necessities. This created a subtle pressure on the Japanese leadership, forcing them to either ignore these inconvenient truths, further alienating their populace, or to engage with them in ways that could inadvertently undermine their own rigid ideological stance. It was a quiet battle of narratives, fought not with bullets but with the subtle dissemination of contrasting realities. Building on this, another crucial layer is the way these seemingly minor administrative decisions within POW camps had far-reaching implications for the post-war legal and ethical frameworks governing conflict. The experiences of managing Japanese POWs, including the challenges and successes related to providing hygiene, contributed to the evolving body of international humanitarian law. Lessons learned, both positive and negative, informed subsequent conventions and guidelines concerning the treatment of prisoners of war. The very act of documenting and analyzing these practices, even if primarily for operational purposes, provided valuable data for future codifications of wartime conduct. Consequently, the simple act of providing soap, when viewed through this lens, becomes more than just a gesture of temporary clemency. It represents a small but significant contribution to the long-term development of international standards aimed at mitigating the inherent barbarity of war. The scent of soap, therefore, carries the faint but persistent aroma of a more civilized future, forged in the crucible of past conflicts. The meticulously crafted narrative of American benevolence extended beyond the POW camps, permeating the broader strategic objectives of the war in the Pacific. While the immediate goal was to demoralize the enemy and undermine their rigid adherence to the code of dying in battle, the long-term vision encompassed the very reconstruction of Japanese society. The U.S. understood that simply defeating Japan militarily would not suffice. A fundamental shift in its societal and ideological underpinnings was necessary to prevent future aggression. The treatment of POWs, therefore, served as a subtle yet potent element within this larger strategy of societal transformation. By demonstrating a capacity for reasoned, even if calculated, humane treatment, the U.S. aimed to introduce a contrasting model of behavior and governance that could over time seep into the Japanese consciousness. Now, consider how this applies when you must dismantle an enemy's deeply entrenched societal structure, not through brute force alone, but by introducing alternative models of behavior and governance. The presence of clean water and soap in the camps was more than just a physical amenity. It was a tangible representation of a different kind of order, one based on principles of public health, basic human rights, and a more pragmatic approach to welfare. This was a quiet assertion that a society's strength could also be measured by its ability to care for its most vulnerable, including its defeated enemies, rather than solely by its capacity for martial prowess and self-sacrifice. This subtle introduction of a different societal paradigm was a crucial, though often overlooked, component of the broader American objective to reshape Japan into a peaceful, democratic nation. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process of cultural diffusion, where the everyday realities of camp life carried implications far beyond the immediate context of captivity. Furthermore, the psychological impact of these amenities on the returning soldiers had a ripple effect on the broader Japanese population. While official propaganda might have continued to paint the enemy in starkly negative terms, the personal testimonies of soldiers who had experienced something different, however limited, introduced a degree of complexity that was difficult to entirely suppress. These accounts, even if initially met with skepticism or shame, could gradually erode the absolute certainty of the enemy's depravity. This subtle shift in perception was invaluable for the post-war occupation authorities, who sought to foster a more cooperative and less antagonistic relationship with the Japanese people. A population that harbored lingering doubts about the absolute monstrosity of its former enemy was potentially more receptive to new ideas and a different vision for the future. Building on this, another crucial layer is the way these experiences contributed to the evolving understanding of international law and humanitarian conduct. The challenges faced in managing POW camps, including the provision of basic services, provided invaluable, albeit often harsh, lessons. The practical difficulties encountered in ensuring adequate hygiene and medical care for large numbers of prisoners highlighted the need for clearer international guidelines and more robust mechanisms for their enforcement. The experiences of the Pacific War, including the varied treatment of Japanese POWs, contributed to the post-war refinement of conventions, like the Geneva Conventions, strengthening the framework for the humane treatment of all combatants, regardless of their nationality or the severity of the conflict. Consequently, the simple act of washing, a seemingly mundane necessity, became a small but significant point of reference in the long and ongoing struggle to codify and uphold humanitarian principles in times of war. The lingering scent of soap, therefore, carried the faint but persistent aroma of a more civilized future, shaped by the hard-won lessons of past conflicts. The strategic imperative behind providing basic hygiene facilities to Japanese POWs wasn't solely about managing immediate camp conditions or even about subtle psychological warfare. It extended into a far more intricate aspect of wartime intelligence gathering and counterintelligence. By observing how prisoners reacted to these unexpected amenities, American intelligence services could glean invaluable insights into the prevailing Japanese mindset, the effectiveness of their own propaganda, and the potential for future manipulation. A soldier's response, be it outright suspicion, tentative acceptance, or even genuine relief, offered a data point. Did they view the soap as a gift or a trap? Did their ingrained fear of the enemy override the basic human desire for cleanliness? Analyzing these reactions provided a nuanced understanding of the psychological resilience and vulnerabilities of the Japanese soldiery, information that could be critical in refining ongoing military operations and shaping future strategic approaches. Now consider how this applies when you must decipher the enemy's internal state through their reactions to your actions. The way a prisoner interacted with the shower facilities, the questions they asked, the subtle shifts in their demeanor, all of this was meticulously, if sometimes informally, observed. Was there a discernible difference in reaction between soldiers from different units or regions? Did those who had experienced more brutal combat exhibit a greater degree of suspicion or, conversely, a more profound appreciation for the respite? These observations, compiled and analyzed, contributed to a richer, more granular understanding of the enemy than could be obtained solely through battlefield intelligence. It was akin to a doctor observing a patient's vital signs and subtle tremors to diagnose an underlying condition, where the prisoner's response to cleanliness served as a diagnostic indicator of their psychological state. Furthermore, this observational intelligence gathering served a dual purpose in the realm of counterintelligence. Understanding the deep-seated suspicion and distrust exhibited by many prisoners allowed American forces to better anticipate and counter potential Japanese intelligence efforts. If prisoners were conditioned to view all enemy actions with extreme caution, they would be less susceptible to overt attempts at manipulation or espionage. Conversely, if any genuine appreciation for the amenities was observed, it might signal a potential opening for more sophisticated psychological operations, albeit ones that had to be carefully calibrated to avoid triggering outright rejection. It was a delicate balancing act, using the provision of basic necessities as a tool not just for managing prisoners, but for understanding and potentially influencing their deeper loyalties and beliefs. This intricate interplay between providing care and extracting intelligence highlights the multifaceted nature of modern warfare, where the battlefield extends far beyond the front lines into the very minds of the combatants. Building on this, another crucial layer is the way these observations informed the broader understanding of Japanese cultural values and their impact on military conduct. The profound shame associated with surrender, for instance, meant that any act of kindness from the enemy was likely to be viewed through the lens of potential manipulation or a sign of the enemy's perceived weakness. Intelligence gathered from observing these reactions provided concrete evidence of the powerful influence of cultural imperatives on individual behavior, even in the extreme circumstances of captivity. This understanding was not merely academic. It had direct implications for how American forces approached prisoner interrogation, propaganda dissemination, and the overall management of occupied territories. Consequently, the simple act of providing a shower and soap, when analyzed through the lens of intelligence gathering, became a key that unlocked deeper insights into the enemy's psyche, revealing not just their immediate reactions but also the underlying cultural currents that shaped their responses. The lingering scent of soap, in this context, was not just a reminder of hygiene, but a subtle olfactory clue to the intricate workings of the enemy's mind. Reflecting on this journey through the forgotten corners of conflict, we've navigated a landscape where the expected narratives of war often falter, revealing something far more complex. The echoes of those experiences, the quiet paradoxes we've uncovered, begin to coalesce not into a simple summation, but into a deeper resonance. It's as if disparate notes, once distinct, now harmonize, creating a richer, more profound chord. The weight of those moments, the unexpected encounters that defied ingrained animosities, now settles, not as a burden of memory, but as a prism through which to view broader human truths. We stand at a precipice, looking back at the intricate weave of decisions, perceptions, and the sheer, often bewildering resilience of the human spirit under duress. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the cumulative effect of these explorations. The threads of strategy, psychology, and stark human need, once appearing distinct, now intertwine, forming a more intricate tapestry than initially perceived. The map of conflict we've seen is not merely drawn with lines of territory and troop movements, but with the invisible contours of human experience, shaped by expectation, disillusionment, and the surprising capacity for recognition across divides. The forest of history, silent on many fronts, has whispered its secrets, revealing patterns not of grand pronouncements, but of subtle shifts in perception, born from the most fundamental of human interactions. The historical record, often a stark ledger of victories and defeats, begins to yield a more nuanced account when we attend to these quieter currents. In light of these insights, the path forward to a final understanding becomes clearer, not by revisiting each point, but by sensing their convergence. The questions that linger are not about the specific events, but about the enduring implications of how humanity confronts its own capacity for both brutality and unexpected grace. The echoes from those forgotten fronts resonate with a peculiar clarity now, suggesting that the most profound lessons are often found not in the roar of cannons, but in the quiet spaces where the lines between adversary and fellow human begin to blur, however fleetingly. It is in these liminal spaces that the true contours of our shared existence are often revealed, demanding a deeper contemplation as we approach our ultimate understanding. The scent of soap, the warmth of water, these were not mere amenities in the crucible of war. They were seismic shifts in perception for those who had been conditioned to expect only the abyss. We have journeyed through the testimonies of forgotten fronts, not to sanitize the brutal calculus of conflict, but to illuminate the astonishing paradoxes it can engender. The narrative of war is often etched in stone, a monument to victories and defeats, to heroes and villains. Yet beneath this grand, unyielding facade lies a more fluid, more human truth, one that whispers of choices made in the face of overwhelming pressure, of the unexpected cracks that appear in even the most hardened ideologies. It is in these quiet fissures that the true essence of our shared humanity often reveals itself, not in grand pronouncements of peace, but in the simple, almost unbelievable acts that defy the prevailing narrative of animosity. Our exploration has unveiled how strategic calculation and fundamental human need can converge, creating moments that ripple far beyond the immediate context of a prisoner of war camp. The provision of basic hygiene, so alien to the deeply ingrained expectations of a defeated enemy, served as a potent, albeit unintentional, catalyst for introspection. It challenged the very definition of otherness, forcing individuals to confront the uncomfortable possibility that their adversary was not the monolithic entity of propaganda, but a complex force capable of actions that transcended the brutal logic of total war. This wasn't about erasing the horrors of conflict, but about acknowledging the persistent flicker of empathy that can, however strategically deployed or incidentally present, pierce through the darkest of nights. The map of human interaction we've discovered is far more intricate than the battle lines suggest. What endures, then, from these forgotten encounters? It is the profound realization that even in the most dehumanizing of circumstances, the recognition of shared humanity remains a potent force. The story of the hot showers and soap is not an isolated anecdote. It is a microcosm of a larger truth. It speaks to the enduring power of dignity, the persistent human need to be seen not merely as a combatant or an enemy, but as an individual. History records the grand strategies and the decisive battles, but it is in these quieter moments, these unexpected intersections of empathy and necessity, that the true texture of human experience is revealed. The choices made, the gestures extended, however small or strategically motivated, leave indelible marks, shaping not just the immediate present, but the long, unfolding narrative of our collective future. The true practice of understanding, therefore, begins now. It is an ongoing engagement with the complexities that war invariably exposes, a commitment to looking beyond the stark binaries that history often imposes. It requires us to listen to the whispers from the forgotten fronts, to acknowledge the paradoxes that challenge our assumptions, and to recognize the enduring capacity for both profound cruelty and surprising grace that resides within us all. The memory of those moments, of the scent of soap cutting through the mires of war, serves as a quiet, persistent reminder that even in the most desolate landscapes, the seeds of compassion, however unintended, can find fertile ground, and that the most profound victories are often those that reaffirm our shared